Hey everyone, Road Breach here, and today we're taking a look at the Transformers Reactivate figures. This first wave of figures includes Optimus Prime, Bumblebee, Soundwave, and Starcream. It may be a while before we get the game, but we can at least look at the toys while we wait. But before we look at the figures, let's look at the boxes these figures come in. Both boxes have these metal-looking trims with these pixel patterns in certain areas. Both boxes also have 3D renders of the figures, but the 2-pack with Bumblebee and Starscream has the actual in-game models on the front and sides, whereas the Optimus and Soundwave 2-pack clearly has 2D artwork of the characters. Both boxes also have these plastic windows, nice to see these again, and screenshots from the game on the back. And finally, the inserts have the loading screens printed on them. Alright, enough of these cardboard cuboids, onto the plastic humanoids. Let's start off by looking at Optimus. I gotta say, this design looks dope. It's another update on the G1 design, but it stands out with the silver cuffs, the silver strips on his shoulders, and the shape of the grill abs aren't something I've seen anywhere else. The boots are very similar to the Bumblebee movie, but the shin vents are smaller. As for the backpack, it's not all that bad, and the boosters are even where they should be. But the head is not my favorite head that Optimus has had. I don't like the rounded mouth plate, and the ears look way more like Grimlock. Besides the head, this design is good. As for accessories, you get his ion blaster and axe, which can peg into his hands, although the axe doesn't really look good from all angles. Both of which can also store on his back with no problems. You also get the Matrix, but Optimus can't hold it at all. They could have given him opening hands, but they just didn't for whatever reason. Speaking of which, articulation is pretty average, with his elbows pulling 90s, and his knees pulling a little over that. You can get good poses out of this figure, but I've seen official Transformers with way better posability. As for the transformation, I think it's a neat take on the usual Optimus transformation, but the clearance with the arms is the biggest issue with this process. Though it is worth it for the struck mode. It looks badass, though compared to the concept art, it's missing some plating to really sell the apocalyptic aesthetic they're going for. And damn, this thing has a massive cab. This thing's gotta have quite the bedroom. And you can also store the weapons in vehicle mode. Next up is Soundwave, because he is the other bot in this 2-pack. This design would be great if his limbs weren't so stringy. His chest is very broad, but his arms and legs aren't proportional to it. And he's got a backpack to make most fembots jealous. And we will get into why that is later. Despite all that criticism, there's nothing much about the aesthetic that I have an issue with. There's details that are reminiscent of his original alt mode, like these bits of silver that are a nod to his rewind and play buttons, and his chest is clearly meant to look like a tape door. The head sculpt is alright, though I prefer it when Soundwave has shades as opposed to this red strip. He comes with a shoulder cannon that you can peg into his shoulder, and this thing looks like it's compatible with Siege blast effects, but I don't have any. And you get his concussion blaster that you can peg into his hand or store on his back. Articulation is better with slightly deeper elbows, deeper knees, and his legs can kick very high. And the shoulder cannon is even posable too. The transformation is the easiest here. It's mainly a case of flipping the limbs into the backpack, and this may be the first and only shell former I willingly bought. I also like that you can just leave the cannon on, and it doesn't even make the process harder to do. And the end result of that conversion is a badass armored car. It does have visible transformation hinges, and I have no idea what this thing is supposed to be, but it looks perfect for the setting of the game. Now, onto the other 2-pack, where we turn our attention to Bumblebee. And this is a great design for him. Some bits of his armor remind me of the Spartans from Halo, namely his gauntlets, and like most modern takes on Bumblebee, the hood becomes his chest, he has door wings, and he's heroically hench. There's some intentional asymmetry with the paint on his gauntlets, but this shin spike I'm very certain was a mistake. But then I watched Perspective N's video on this 2-pack, and his copy of Bumblebee had the same thing going on with the right shin spike. So this must be intentional, and it just didn't look that way. The head sculpt is pretty good. It's not entirely obvious that this is supposed to be Bumblebee due to the shape of the horns, but I appreciate it for standing out, and I appreciate the expression of "I'm going to kick your ass." As for accessories, you get these 2 submachine guns that you can peg into his hands or on the back of his forearms. The articulation is decent, but he doesn't have wrists or a waist joint due to the transformation. And speaking of the transformation, there is one joint that is a little too tight, and getting the windshield back out if you get it stuck is very annoying, but this process is otherwise pretty good. And the vehicle mode that results from that process is something I really like. It's like a cross between a Jeep and a Beetle with armor welded on, and it's tricked out with a spoiler and a far more powerful engine. There are bits of robot mode cable that stick out from the back, but this mode is still pretty good despite that. You can keep the guns behind the forearms or peg them into the hood. I have a lot of Bumblebee figures, and this one is a good addition to my collection. And finally, we have Starcream. One thing I noticed about this design for Starcream is that he has very lanky limbs, which I feel makes sense for a flyer. Starcream has usually been depicted as kind of fruity, but the addition of the black accents makes him look less so. And this figure also has some asymmetrical sculpting and paintwork, which is something that I feel the other figures should have had. Another thing that I feel these figures should have had was siege battle damage. I feel it would have made tons of sense considering the setting of the game, and it would have made each 2-pack not feel like it was overpriced. But he does have shoulder intakes that are now a part of his backpack, these turbines in his chest, and the orange cockpit that's a nod to his G1 design. And the kibble is handled pretty well here too. And the head sculpt, while it does look like Starscream, it also really reminds me of a Halo Spartan with the forehead of the helmet. For accessories, you get his null rays, which look far more like machine guns. These can peg into his forearms, but the pegs are too short to be held in his hands. I also like that they're not the same mold to further add to the asymmetry. I especially like that this one looks like it could be part of a tank with the metal plate. Articulation is once again pretty good, and he even has really good forward movement on his legs. The transformation is a fun take on the typical Seeker conversion, with the turbines taking place of where the intakes usually go, and the cockpit even folds up when going into robot mode. And the jet mode is on par with the Earthrise figure. I'm sure there's an aerospace engineer that'll point out that this thing wouldn't be flyable beyond the underside kibble, but I think it's a cool approximation of a MiG-25. Although this one has 3 engines. You can also peg the null rays under the wings. Overall, these figures are pretty good. This first wave of Reactivate figures is a good first impression for this line. They look good, and they pose pretty well, but I do feel like Optimus's transformation could have been a little better. They're good figures, but I just feel like they're overpriced. Thanks for watching, and gotta zoom.